Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the ISBEO SafetyNet webinar series. I'm Catherine Hilst. I'm the ISBEO Operations Manager, and I'm your host for the day. Just a couple of housekeeping items for everyone. You all will be on mute and will stay on mute during the course of the presentation. There is a control panel generally in the bottom right of your screen, and there you have an option to type in questions. Please feel free to type those in as they come up. And we'll answer those after Madeline is done with the presentation. So I'm super excited to host the series, currently of 2 webinars, maybe 3, from Polaris Aero, where Madeline will be discussing resiliency in business aviation operations and how to set the stage for a practical application of resilience engineering in your organization. Madeline is the Manager of Customer Experience and Safety Training at Polaris Aero LLC, and she comes with several years of experience in the business aviation sector, including a successful run as Safety Specialist, ASAP Manager, and VOCUS SMS Administrator for a major 135 operation. She's also a recreational private pilot and currently working on her Master of Engineering and Master in Engineering of Advanced Safety Engineering and Management. Madeline, welcome back. I'm excited to hear this today, and the session is all yours.
Thank you, Catherine. I am happy to be back. So today's topic, as Catherine mentioned, is going to focus on resilience engineering. And this is going to be a 2-part series. So I'll preface today's discussion with it will be a bit more abstract in that it will set the stage for the second session, which will be more about the practical application of resilience within our organizations. So I just wanted to preface with that. The second thing I actually want to mention before we jump into the topic today is that I don't want you to think about this topic necessarily as a safety topic. Resilience engineering transcends general safety system management and other safety concepts that we generally talk about. So think of resilience engineering as something that can be applied by the entire organization from the top down, not just by safety personnel. Now, of course, many of you on the call are likely safety personnel and are going to be able to extract some information from today, hopefully, and take that back to your organization and lead these efforts, or at least make your teams aware of these sorts of topics that we'll be talking about. That'll make a little bit more sense once I get into the rest of today's presentation. So with that, I'm going to kick it off with a question. So I want you to think about what constitutes organizational success. How do you define if your organization is successful? It's pretty common for us to think about growth, profits, or 0 accidents and 0 incidents as what constitutes organizational success, right? If we are growing or if we are profitable, and if we do not have accidents or incidents, we are considered to be successful in some way. But what if I told you that a company had positive growth, had excellent profits, had 0 accidents and 0 incidents? If we're looking at an organization that has all 4 of those things, we're actually missing part of the picture. We don't know actually how they are successful. We know that certain metrics indicate that they might be, but there's a different kind of behind the scenes picture that we're not quite seeing or considering. And that's what we're going to talk about a little bit more today. So I'm going to suppose that organizational success is defined by an organization's ability to adapt to change, disruptions, crises, and opportunities, and sustain its operations with minimal impact. So think about that definition, keep it in mind, and we're going to come back to this at the end of the presentation. I'm going to start off conceptually talking about the type of industry that we operate in. Everyone here knows or is probably wearing an analog watch. Now, this type of watch is actually something that we refer to in safety systems thinking as a simple system. We refer to it as a simple system because if your watch breaks, it's probably going to be very easy to identify what the problem is. And again, we're talking about analog watches here, not necessarily the fancy new tech watches or Apple watches that exist today. So with an analog watch, if your watch breaks, you can probably take it into someone who's going to be able to take your watch apart, figure out what the issue is, fix that problem, and put the watch back together. In other words, all of the parts of a watch are interconnected and interactive. So they're all working together to produce one system. The relationship between cause and effect are direct. So it's very simple to identify one thing that is causing an effect. And something such as manuals and checklists are fairly comprehensive as far as fixing a simple system. So keep that in mind. Now let's talk about a different type of system, one we're generally more familiar with, and that are aircraft. Now we know that aircraft are made of thousands and thousands of components. But what we know about aircraft is we know every single one of those components, and we know how they all interact with each other. Now, those interactions are generally a little bit more complicated, and that's why we refer to this system as a complicated system, right? All of the parts are still interconnected and interactive, similar to a simple system, but they're also diverse, meaning it's more difficult to understand what a cause is of an effect, or it can be more difficult to understand what the effects would be of one particular cause. But it is a closed loop system, and at the end of the day, we can make those identifications. In other words, an aircraft is the sum of its parts. If you take an aircraft apart and you put it back together, you're going to have the same system. Now let's put this in a different type of context. Let's look at an aircraft now when we have people involved. So we're talking about pilots, mechanics, line operations, anyone who works behind the scenes, such as schedulers and dispatchers, managers, and even air traffic control. Once you introduce the human element to a complicated or a simple system, you're now changing that type of system. And that's what we refer to in systems thinking as a complex system. Now, this is really where we're going to focus today. Our system, or our aviation industry, and our organizations are considered complex because essentially they involve people. So the parts of our system, meaning all of these simple and complicated things that are involved, and the humans that are involved, make up interactions, interconnectedness, and diversity of those parts. But we're also adaptive, meaning we can learn from our behaviors. Now, the tricky thing about complex systems is that there are an infinite number of causes and effects because humans are an unknown variable within the system. We cannot predict every interaction amongst these parts, and that's what makes the causes and effects relationships an infinite number of causes and effects. The other element of this is that adaptation is not predictable. So in the same way that there are variables, we cannot also understand what those adaptations are by humans because of the variability of that system. That'll make a little bit more sense once we progress through the presentation. So just keep in mind that our industry and our organizations are complex in that we have people involved. The people introduce variability into that system, and that variability is unpredictable. So this is the general flow of what today's presentation is going to include. We've already talked about aviation as a complex system and our organizations as complex. I'm going to break that down into why that's important. And that's what's coming next, which is we're going to talk about low probability, high consequence organizations and high reliability organizations and why that's important. I'm then going to talk about our traditional view of safety, the traditional view of safety, and why we need to change our view of safety, how that correlates to resilience engineering, offer a few case studies, and then some practical ideas for moving forward. This is all going to set the stage for the second presentation, which is going to occur in November. I'm sure some of you might know what this picture is of, and for those of you who don't, this is a representation of the Chernobyl nuclear power plant. Now, for those of you who aren't aware, which again, many of you are if you've taken any sort of safety class prior, Chernobyl caused essentially mass casualties that are still, we're still learning more about the casualties of that today. The effects of Chernobyl are long lasting, right? Not only were there mass casualties, but it caused extensive environmental contamination that will surpass our lifetime and significant economic disruption. Now, an equally known catastrophic incident is that of Deepwater Horizon, which you can see on the right-hand side of your screen there. And in this event, a single incident killed 11 people on Deepwater Horizon oil rig out in the ocean. And what's interesting about that particular event is that that month that this event occurred, this location was actually celebrating 7 years of having 0 recordable accidents or incidents. We're going to come back to that. Now, something that hits a little bit closer to home is this accident, which if you haven't seen this picture before, this is of the Tenerife accident that occurred, where 2 Boeing 747s, KLM and Pan Am, collided and resulted in 583 fatalities. Now, these are just 3 examples of catastrophes that occurred in complex industries and in industries that we consider to have low probability, high consequence, or that we consider high reliability organizations. So let's look a little bit deeper at what those 2 terms actually mean. The first, low probability, high consequence industries. So there's a definition on the screen here, which I'll read as industries whereby events are considered corresponding to as being almost impossible to occur, having severely negative socio-economic consequences for health, safety, and the environment, and events whose assessment is fraught with uncertainty whereby experts potentially disagree. Now I'm going to break that down into something a little bit more digestible. In essence, low probability, high consequence industries are those whereby it is less likely for high consequential events to occur, but the sheer nature of those high consequence events, meaning severely negative impacts to the environment, to health, and to safety of personnel, is of paramount importance. So in aviation, this is very relevant, right? It is not likely that we will have an accident in our organization, but knowing that if one occurs, it has a highly consequential impact is going to increase our attention towards prevention of such a consequence. Now let's look at high reliability organizations. That is organizations that by design are prone to catastrophe via errors, yet somehow manage to avoid that catastrophe because they simply cannot afford to fail. And that's paraphrased from a lecture by Carlene Roberts in 2021, earlier this year. Now I'm going to phrase that a little bit differently too. Think of something like a naval ship where you have highly consequential things happening on that ship at a constant rate, right? You have these massive aircraft that are landing on a ship in the middle of the ocean where there is a lot of variability, right? Not only in the weather and in the conditions, but because of the people that are involved. And these organizations, such as these naval ships, generally avoid failure. And it's really interesting when we start to look at why these organizations are avoiding failure at such a successful rate. That has to do a lot about the environment that they're fostering on these ships. And that's something that we're going to talk about later. But it also applies to aviation, right? It's similar to low probability, high consequence nature of our industry. Whereas in high reliability organizations, we simply cannot afford to fail because if we do, it will result in such high consequences that are detrimental to the industry, right? Now, of course, we can learn from those, so there is something to be said for that. But we're going to talk a little bit more about why that way of thinking is going to actually inhibit our progress in terms of aviation safety. So I just wanted to set the stage with these two definitions, and we're going to mention these throughout the rest of the presentation. Let's talk about our traditional view of safety. Now, what's really interesting about our traditional view of safety is that we attribute errors and problems to people. So we view people as the problem. And in that traditional view, we then think that if we can fix people through compliance and regulation, that we will eliminate the problem. And then we measure our success by the number of negative outcomes that occur. So in other words, a reduction of things going wrong. So a reduction in accidents and incidents therefore means that we're safer. Now, what's interesting about this traditional view of safety is that when you consider the complex nature of our industry, whereas the complexity is because of human involvement, if you attribute that people are the problem, you're basically saying that the only way to quote unquote fix a complex system is basically to remove all of the variability of that system, which is sheerly impossible, right? You would need to remove people from the system in order for that system to be safe. That's just not possible, right? That doesn't make sense. And so what we need to do is change our view, our traditional view of safety. We're going to look at this a little bit deeper, but something I want to talk about here is the unpredictable nature of complex systems. We know that complex systems are unpredictable, we know that they're adaptive, and we know that they rarely behave in the same way twice because of all of the variability in the system. So think about a situation that you perhaps have gone through and that you've come out the other end successful on by your terms of success, right? You're perhaps put in a situation in the cockpit, or if you're a maintenance technician, you were put in a situation where there was a lot of variability in that situation. You didn't quite know what needed to be done, yet you got through that situation with a positive outcome. Now, let's say we put you in that same situation twice. You are going to adapt in that you are probably going to interface with that environment in a different way because you probably have learned something. So our traditional view of safety, that people are the problem, is interesting in that because of our adaptive nature, we are actually the solution. So we're going to talk about that more in our new view of safety. I'm going to shift gears a little bit and talk about 3 other concepts that have to do with complex industries and high reliability organizations. Stick with me, this will all tie together at the end. What we're going to look at first is what this is referred to as Heinrich's triangle. And that concept behind Heinrich's triangle is that we can control fatalities, serious injuries, and minor injuries, or catastrophic events, serious events, and minor events by looking at and controlling for near misses and unsafe acts that occur. In other words, this is saying that there are certain things in our organizations that are measurable, such as minor, serious, and fatal or catastrophic incidents. And if we reduce the number of minor incidents that occur, we are therefore reducing the probability of serious incidents, and therefore we're reducing the probability of catastrophic incidents as well. And it can go even deeper than that. And this was developed post Heinrich's time, which is that there are things in our organizations that are not as measurable, but are still present. And if we address those, we can ultimately reduce injuries, incidents, and therefore catastrophic events. Now, this has actually been challenged in recent years, because if you look at complex organizations, high reliability organizations, and low probability, high consequence organizations, and look deep into those histories, you'll actually come to find that the causal factors that are attributed to those highly consequential events, these singular fatalities or single high consequence events are actually different than the causal factors of the minor and the serious incidents and injuries. So in other words, the triangle actually looks a little bit more like this. The reason this is important is because we have this false perception that if we reduce unsafe acts, we are therefore reducing our probability of an accident or incident occurring. And that's not necessarily true. We'll speak to this when I talk about our new view of safety, so just keep this in mind. There are several different new views of safety that exist, and they all have different terms associated with them. One, they're all listed, a few are listed on the left-hand side there, right? So we have the concept of safety to thinking, or safety differently, or safety now. What all of these have in common, however, are the 4 items that you see listed in the middle there. First, that blame does not help the situation. Second, that people are the solution, which I alluded to earlier. Third, that open communication with our teams is paramount. And fourth, that we need to study not only why things are going wrong, that is important to learn from, but what is going well and why. And that is the crux of moving us from that traditional view into our new view of safety. We need to not be so concerned with things that have already happened, because the likelihood that those things are going to happen in the same way again is very low when you look at the adaptability and the unpredictability of our systems. Now, sure, we need to put controls in place for the things that are known to us, but we need to change our view, not only from what those things are that are going wrong, but why are certain things going well, or why are we coming out of situations with a positive, or rather not a negative impact, and what can we learn from that? There's this common concept that to err is human. This was first, I think, appeared in Shakespeare, right? And he said that to err is human. So in our complex systems, if we say that our system needs to be error-free, we are essentially saying that that system is going to fail time and time again, because it is not possible to remove error from human. The interesting thing is that our decisions and our actions are often what we consider to be errors, but it's not as binary as that. We can't say that we either committed an error or we did not commit an error. And that has to do with context. It has to do with how we perceive success. I'm going to give you an example here, and I encourage anyone on this call to go ahead and watch this short TED Talk. It's only about 10 minutes long about human error. Now, take a look at what's happening with this woman on the left-hand side of your screen. She's straddling a ladder and a door, and she is painting the wall. Now, how do you think that this woman is defining success? Well, I can tell you success is defined by not getting paint on the ceiling. That's her goal. She needs to paint the wall and not get paint on the ceiling. She's not thinking about anything else. But here's what's interesting. If she were to successfully not get paint on the ceiling and get down from the ladder, nothing were to happen, we would say, ah, you're a genius. That was smart. You got the job done, right? We might even praise them or reward them for what they did and replicate that behavior in the future. Now, let's say she failed at this and she fell off the ladder. Well, we would be inclined to say, well, yeah, of course, right? This wasn't a smart thing to do. It's pretty obvious that this is an unsafe act. What's interesting about this is we are letting the results of what she is doing dictate how we feel about it. She's doing the same thing. It's just, was she successful or was she not successful? And we're letting that binary approach dictate how we feel about this. It's the same adaptation now. This is happening all of the time in our organizations. Our humans aren't always going to face situations that they have a policy, procedure, or checklist for, meaning they're using their knowledge and their perception of the situation and their definition of success in that moment to define what their actions and decisions are. And it's only how they come out on the other side that we decide if that was smart or if it was not so smart, right? And then we let that determine if we're going to blame someone for doing something wrong or if we're going to praise them because they were innovative. But like I said, it's the same adaptation. So at the end of the day, no, this is not safe. But in your organization, how often are you perceiving these sorts of situations and raising a hand? How often are you making yourself aware, or how often are your employees reporting on something that even though they came out safe on the other end of, they had to innovate? They had to make a decision that they may not have been prepared for. They had to use context to inform their decision and decision making. It's in these adaptations that we're going to learn from. Because what we've been learning from in the past with our traditional view of safety is that in that adaptation, if something went wrong, well, now we're going to learn from it, not if something went right. And it's that minute change in that way of thinking, in that nuance of someone doing something in a specific way, but coming out safe on the other end that we can learn from. Why did they make that decision? What was the context? And how can we apply that decision making elsewhere in our organization? Now, the problem with some of these even new views of safety thinking is that they're not applied holistically to the organization. Resilience engineering, as I mentioned at the very beginning, is not just about making sure that we're not blaming people and making sure that people are a part of the solution and having open communication with our teams. It's about how we're applying that at a fundamental level in our organization. It's about curating an environment where there is a deference to expertise, there is a presence of psychological safety, and we are empowering our people to make decisions that ensure that they do not result in a negative consequence. So in other words, we're talking about ensuring that things go right, not avoiding the things that could go wrong. All right, now let's talk a little bit more about what resilience engineering actually is, since that's, of course, the topic of today and will be the topic of our next session as well. Now, if you remember this slide from the very beginning of the presentation about organizational success, the definition that I gave you for organizational success is actually how we define resilience engineering. Therefore, resilience engineering is the ability of an organization to adapt to change, disruptions, crises, and opportunities, and sustain its operations with minimal impact. The key word there is adaptation, and as we know from what we've just talked about in complex organizations, adaptation is a result of human variability. It's easy to talk about, or just to give you a definition about what resilience engineering is, but it can help to understand what it is not, because there are some differences in how we can perceive our organizations. We use two common buzzwords nowadays to talk about our safety programs in our organizations. One of those is robustness and the other is proactivity. But there are some issues with these two words in and of themselves in how we approach system safety. And I don't want you to conflate these with resilience engineering. Robustness is more about the ability of an organization to respond, or its ability to perform within predetermined boundaries or conditions. So in other words, robustness is about confronting the things that are known in our environments. Now, with complex organizations, as we know, there is too much variability. So while robustness is a part of resilience engineering, putting controls in place for the things that are known is important, it is not comprehensive. And the same can be said for proactivity, right? Proactivity is about predicting what can happen and planning for that, putting controls in place based on what we determine as proactive measures. But again, the problem with that is the variability of our complex organizations. It just simply is not possible to predict everything that could go wrong and put controls in place for it. Even if we could do that, our manuals, our training, it would never end. It would be so complicated for us to understand that it honestly wouldn't move us towards safety. So resilience engineering is not just about putting controls in place for things that are known, and it's not just about predicting things that could go wrong and putting controls in place for those. It's about curating an environment where both of these things are happening, but there's more going on in the background. So here are some elements of resilience engineering beyond robustness and proactivity. First, I want you to think about it as an infrastructure of your organization or as part of the DNA of your organization, right? And that goes back to what I said earlier. This is not a safety practice. This is a business practice. Second, it's about how the organization functions as a whole. If your organization is experiencing resilience, it's experiencing growth and profits, right? It's experiencing efficiency. Now, there is something to be said for an efficiency thoroughness trade-off, which I'm not going to go deep into today, but what I really just want you to focus on is about resilience as a function of the organization as a whole. And then three, it is about, or third, it's about the ability of the organization to respond, to monitor, to learn, and anticipate. And you might be thinking, well, we're already doing these things, and absolutely you are. Safety management systems are a key element in resilience engineering. But our safety measures do not stop at safety management systems, right? Just because you have a safety management system doesn't necessarily mean that your organization is experiencing resilience. Those four terms, respond, monitor, learn, and anticipate, are essentially the four quadrants that make up resilience engineering. So some of our practices fall into these quadrants, right? Of course, right now, we are very good at responding. Aviation is known for responding to accidents and incidents generally well. Monitoring and learning is something that we're still struggling with, and as is anticipation. Now, of course, there are certain elements, as I mentioned, of safety management systems that help with this, but there are some other things that we can be doing beyond what safety management systems generally provide. So I'm going to take a look at a couple of case studies, and I'm not going to do a deep dive into any of these. I'm just going to use some high-level examples to hopefully illustrate resilience engineering. On the screen here, you see a couple of different industries, 5 to be exact. Now, a lot of what I'm going to be talking about today was actually derived from an article written by a woman by the name of Carleen Roberts, who I actually used to portray our definition of high reliability organizations. And I'll have a reference for her at the end of this if you want to do a deep dive into that article. Carleen Roberts spent time in 3 different organizations. She spent time with air traffic control, on a naval ship, and at a nuclear power plant. Significant time. And her goal was to understand why these types of organizations fail so infrequently. In other words, why they are considered high reliable organizations. This was the result of her case studies, right? First, all of these types of organizations never viewed past success as a guarantee of future safety. They never normalized how safe, quote unquote, or how they perceived the safety of their organization. Second, they kept the discussion of risk alive even when everything looks safe. Now, there are a lot of different tactics that were used in order to accomplish this. One of them was just driving fear into people, right? And some of that there is an element of truth to, right? We can't always perceive our organizations or our systems as safe because that's going to inhibit our curiosity of the system and inhibit our ability to respond. Third, they listened to minority perspective and invited dissenting opinion and maintained that curiosity. Now, inviting dissenting opinion is very interesting with high reliability organizations in complex industries. That dissenting opinion is where we're going to learn. It's where we're going to make sense of things that are happening that we were not prepared for or that were unpredictable. And four, there was always someone with the willingness and authority to put their hand up and just simply say no. In other words, they empowered people in the organizations to really just not only make sense of situations, but be able to confront management and leadership and just simply say, no, this is deemed too unsafe or too risky for our operations. Now, all too often in industries that are less successful and aren't as highly reliable, you don't have this in place. You don't have an infrastructure of people willing to stop an operation because it's deemed unsafe. Now, what can be difficult with that, right, is sometimes we don't feel like we have the power in terms of the data or enough information to really explain to leadership or explain to management why something is unsafe. It's just our expertise that is allowing us to perceive a situation in that way. That can be tricky, and there are solutions for this. So in essence, these are the four things that really constitute the success of high reliability organizations, and we can learn a lot from this and adapt it to our own organizations and make sure that these things are relevant and apparent. There's one case in there that I didn't mention, and I'm going to talk about that in a minute, but where I want to move us to is what we can do going forward, how we can apply what we know about low probability, high consequence environments, how we can apply what we know about complex organizations and high reliability organizations to our own industries and our own organizations to ensure that they are resilient. So what can we do? Well, the first and the most obvious is actually just to communicate with our stakeholders. Over communication is better than under communication, even if you don't know what you need to communicate, right? Now, of course, we want to make sure that in general, the things that we're communicating with our stakeholders are relevant and there are things that we are learning from. There are basic measures in safety management systems that are ensuring we're already doing this. Safety promotion and safety assurance are two key pillars of safety management systems that help us with this. But what's happening is that we're focusing almost too much on only communicating the results of investigations or the results of risk management, and communication needs to transcend that. Let's take a look at actually one key example in recent history, which is that of the pandemic in New Zealand. So in case any of you didn't know, New Zealand had a particularly successful run with keeping the pandemic out of their country. Now, of course, there were still cases that were relevant, but what's interesting about this is actually the approach that their Prime Minister, Jacinda Ardern, took with this. From the get-go, she did not have the information that she needed to make an adequate decision or make a sound decision, but she over-communicated with her constituents that she did not have that information, but that she was still going to make a decision essentially based on intuition. It was that intuition that led New Zealand through the pandemic in such a successful way. And there's a lot that we can learn from that. I'm going to explain this in a different way actually in our next example. The second thing that we can do as organizations is to create a culture of empowerment. We can foster an environment of psychological safety by using our intuition, as mentioned, asking people what is going well or what is going wrong and why, or even using a survey to gauge this type of information. to gauge the willingness of people to participate in these types of conversations that are necessary to create this culture of empowerment. We can build a reliance on a deference to expertise, which I've mentioned earlier, right? Something that can inhibit us from allowing our constituents, our employees, to relying on their expertise or relying on their intuition can be as simple as the verbiage that we have in our manuals. What sort of agentive language exists in our manuals that inhibits people from feeling that they have the ability to make decisions based on their expertise? Part of that has to do with our retribution policies, right? Ensuring that we are communicating with our employees that there is no penalty for coming forward with information that not necessarily is demeaning or detrimental to the organization, but about things that are going right as well. And then finally, fostering learning and not the traditional kind of learning. In other words, we can, in order to create a culture of empowerment, we can create opportunities for discussion, invite dissenting opinion, use lessons learned, practice sense making and sense giving. And so this is what I want to use in order to communicate the importance of this. This is actually a graphic that I saw posted on LinkedIn just not too long ago, and you can put this into different contexts, but the way I want you to read this is as one of these dinosaurs, actually as the employee, the one on the left, and the one on the right as the manager. Now the way this reads essentially is that our employees aren't necessarily coming to us because they need us to answer their questions. They don't know what they don't know in some cases, and in other cases they just need us to reframe the context of that question or provide sense giving back to them, right? We have a big picture of what's going on in our organization. There is a lot of value in safety managers because we see what is happening. And it's in communicating that information and that knowledge back to our stakeholders where we're going to foster not only an environment of psychological safety, but we're going to offer that our employees can use a deference of expertise in their practical environments to help them navigate situations that we do not have regulations, policies, procedures, and checklists for. And again, that stems back to the variability and unpredictability of our systems. Relying on that intuition and that deference to expertise in a more fundamental way is going to allow us to navigate those situations and foster a more resilient organization and environment for our employees. The third thing we can do is embrace evidence-based training. Now, this is something that aviation is actually doing fairly well, but we can still take this to the next level. And there's a quote here that reads that emphasizing the systematic debriefing of flight crew after a flight, focusing on potential points of improvement, but also positive aspects of performance is a boost towards confidence, which is a key element of resilience. By better understanding one's own performance, competence can also be improved. So this alludes to the themes that we've been discussing all through today's presentation, but more importantly, it gives us something that we can do practically. Are your organizations utilizing pre-flight and post-flight briefings? And not only are you utilizing them, but are you capturing the results? Are you looking at those results and analyzing them and using them to inform your training, your modules that you're creating moving forward, or even the discussions that you're hosting internally? And this isn't just specific to flight crews too, right? Maintenance technicians can also do these types of debriefings or pre-briefings, and same with even schedulers and dispatchers. Now, I'm going to talk about the fourth and final thing that we can do here in just a moment, but I want to call attention back to a few of the case studies that I mentioned. There was one in particular that I didn't touch on, which is actually in the middle section on that bottom row there. You might be wondering what that picture is all about, and so I'm going to go into explaining that. I'm going to suggest that the fourth thing that we can do as an organization is learn from improv. I'm going to make an assumption here that everyone on the call today likes to laugh. We like improv in the way that we like the creativity that comes with it. There's a lot, though, that we can learn from this. And so actually, in this photograph is my sister. I know a particularly a lot about improv just because I've been around it as a child, since my sister is a part of improv and performs in New York City on an improv stage. Now, you might be thinking, well, what could we possibly learn from this, right? There isn't a lot of risky behavior in improvisation. The amount of risk really probably is condensed into what this gentleman is doing, which is standing on a chair, right? Not that risky behavior, but it's in how these people adapt that we can learn. So here are the three things that we can learn from improv. First, we can learn how to share our points of view. Every single person on my sister's team here has a different perspective, and through the creative use of language, inflections, postures, and even just our physical interactions with people, we can learn from our respective teammates, and we can develop a group of sense making from this, right? We can develop a culture, we can develop an environment where we are learning from the perspective of other people's. All too often, this is lost in our particular industry. Now, something that differentiates our aviation community from that of a naval ship, for example, is that we're often not all together all of the time, right? The schedules of pilots and managers and dispatchers and maintenance technicians is so, in some cases, erratic or unpredictable that it's not probable for us all to be in the same place at the same time, learning from each other constantly. So this point, sharing our points of view, can be more challenging in our industry, but that makes it even more important, because what it means is we're often losing that perspective of our counterparts who are experiencing very similar situations that we can learn from. The second thing we can learn from improv is how to explore and heighten other people's points of view. Understanding the point of view is the first step, but the next step is to see value in that. So when I mentioned the importance of inviting dissenting opinion into conversation, that's a bit of what we're talking about here. We need to recognize that we are not all-knowing. We have not all experienced every situation that we will ever experience in our lifetime. And our counterparts have experienced things that we haven't, and there's significant value in actually listening, internalizing, and making sense of that. And the third thing we can do is learn from their commitment to improv. Improv doesn't happen because you have a collection of people coming together every Saturday night and just performing, right? These teams practice day in and day out. They are committed to understanding how they can learn from their counterparts. They're committed to learning how they can communicate with these people, what language needs to be used, how they can perceive what someone else is saying, and internalize and understand that. So, point being, it takes commitment from us, not only as safety personnel, but from our teams in order to move towards learning from each other and therefore in improving resilience. Now, I understand that these four things that I had mentioned that we can do are fairly abstract in nature. Resilience engineering is fairly abstract as well. It's a new concept. The key takeaways I want you to have from this are that because aviation is a complex industry, and because of the variability in our organizations, we need to harness the learning from our organizations, from our people. We need to foster an environment where we can allow people to not only make sense of situations with their counterparts, with their community, but also internalize that and apply that so that they can utilize a difference of expertise in order to navigate situations that they're unfamiliar with, they were unprepared for, or that were unpredictable in nature. We need to shift from understanding why something went wrong and shift towards understanding how we can ensure things are going right more often than not. We need to make a shift away from blaming people, because that only focuses on an outcome, and shift towards fostering an understanding of why someone made the decision, why someone took a shortcut, how we can be more efficient, and how we can improvise in those situations. So with that, our next session is going to be on practical implementation of these concepts, things that you can actively apply within your organization in a more meaningful way to move you out of a reactive state and into a more resilient state of your organization. So Catherine, I'm going to hand it back off to you. And while I do that, I do just want to put up a reference list of some key concepts that I talked about today regarding low probability, high consequence industries, high reliability organizations, and resilience engineering topics.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Madeline. I have always thought of safety as a very creative approach, and you just sort of confirmed that for me with your improv example. That is a great way of thinking about it in terms of all of these elements of resilience. So thank you for that. That was great. We have a couple of questions, and a thought that I thought was great came from your comment about to err is human. And the comment was, and Aristotle said it even earlier, but the more important part of the quote came from Cicero, which is, but to persist in error is the act of a fool, which does sound exactly like what you've been talking about with resilience. So great context for that. I'm gonna save all of that for myself and steal it for other things. One question that came up is, in a data-driven world, which we are these days, what's one practical tip you can give that would move us towards resiliency?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. So again, resiliency, if we remember those 4 key terms, part of it is reaction, part of it is monitoring. So something that we can do to still move us towards resilience right now is evaluate any report that we receive or any information that we receive in light of context. So to not necessarily focus so much on, again, attributing blame to an individual or condensing our causal factors to a simple root cause that is specific to human error, right? We need to look at the information coming into our system in light of its context, understand all of the causal factors that amounted to that one situation occurring, and then using those causal factors as an indicator of what is going on in your organization, right? Our Polaris, or the tool that Polaris Aero provides, our VOCUS SMS tool, is it really emphasizes this, right? So when you promote any sort of report, whether that's from an ASAP report, an accident report, hazard report, whatever type of report is coming into the system, we encourage you to process that and not focus so much on the consequence, but focus on what led to the decision making that ultimately led to that consequence, right? So we don't necessarily want to focus so much on the outcomes, but why that particular event happened in the first place. Now, again, that is alluding to part of the reactive element of resilience engineering, which is still critically important. Something else that we can do, which I alluded to in my 3rd recommendation, is to look at our pre-flight and post-flight information. There are certain ways that this can be captured in your organization. The first step is just to capture that, right? Having pre-flight and post-flight conversations are good. That's an excellent step. But capturing that data or capturing that information in a meaningful way and then analyzing that information is going to allow us to see a glimpse into the decision making of our pilots, or it's going to allow us to understand those adaptations that people are making in the cockpit or in the hangar or behind the desk that are not necessarily considered deviations, they're just considered adaptations that we can then learn from, right? Whether there was a good outcome or a bad outcome, it doesn't matter. We're just looking at why that adaptation was made. So ensuring that the information is being captured and then secondarily analyzing that information is going to move us towards that more resilient state and out of such a reactive state of system safety.
That's a great rephrasing when you talk about language as well, that it's an adaptation and why. That's a great word for that perspective. Another one, you mentioned that causal factors may be different for the near misses than for the more catastrophic events. How would a resilience approach help an organization find the differences?
So I appreciate that question being asked, because this gets a little bit more theoretical, and there's a lot of research that I could go into to support this. In essence, these low probability, high consequence events, the nature of those catastrophic things, they are going to happen in complex environments because of the variability in our systems, right? The goal isn't to reduce those from occurring. Of course, we don't want those to occur, but it's just the sheer fact, it's the sheer nature of our industries that they will continue to occur. Where we need to focus is ensuring that more things are going right than not, reducing the amounts of accidents and incidents that are of lesser severity, because we're able to control those more. They happen more frequently, and they're still of significant concern for us. So Catherine, I know you and I talked about this a little bit the other day as well, right? We need to learn from our catastrophic events, but the fundamental difference is that we're never going to be able to predict what those are and remove the probability of high consequential events from happening from our systems. We need to shift from trying to prevent that to trying to curate a system that moves us away from only being reactive in nature and only caring about learning from the past, right? And focusing on the presence of things going right within your organization, right? Are we able to foster an environment where people can make better decisions, where there's a better reliance on a deference to expertise, and we're not only trying to adhere to regulation and adhere to company policies, where we're taking a critical look at our internal policies and understanding that they're not going to be comprehensive and there needs to be room for personal decision making and for that reliance on a deference to expertise. Catherine, I want to pass it off to you actually and get your thoughts on that.
Oh, you're flipping that around on me. Well, I agree. I think the idea of looking at what's going right is an incredibly important piece of information for an organization, and those to actually highlight those and use those as a guiding light in the context of your full safety system, I think is a really critical element of this. And there are great ways that you're talking about, and I'm extremely excited to hear part two of this to get some ideas on the practical approach and application to this. That was sneaky, Madeline. I do have a couple more questions before we're done. And one of them has to do with, would our recent work adapting to the COVID pandemic to continue flying safely be an example of organizational resilience?
Absolutely it would. Absolutely it would. That's an excellent example of being confronted with something that we are just simply unprepared for. And every single step that we took in reaction to COVID-19 alludes to how resilient our organizations are. What were our adaptations like? We can introspectively look at our organizations and say, the way in which we made these decisions was good. It was adequate. It was poor. It was excellent, right? Understanding what led us to make those decisions And the context of that decision making is what's going to allow us to learn more about our organization and prepare for future decision making in situations where there is unpredictability, which is the general nature of our complex organizations.
And just
Absolutely.
goes right back to your example of improv. If COVID wasn't a living example of that for many operators, I don't know what else would be. It's like, oh, that's changed now. What are we going to do? Looking at different perspectives. So I love that juxtaposition that you made there. One more, do you see a lot of flight departments performing active resiliency measures today, or is it more that organizations do resiliency type things unknowingly? And then it says maybe pre-flight, post-flight example follow-up.
Yeah, that's an excellent question. So in general, we are all experiencing resiliency right now. The goal is to understand what that means and how to foster an even more resilient system in the future. The key with resiliency is that unlike our approach to safety systems, where we think or we perceive that if we train our individuals about safety management system practices, if we have a defined safety management system, a manual and policies and processes in place, that okay, we've done our part, we've done our due diligence, we have a safety management system, and we're good to go. That's a little bit short-sighted in the sense that that's not all that encompasses success of an organization. Remember when I had mentioned that resiliency is a business practice, not just a safety practice. So in other words, yes, we are doing things right now that are fostering a resilient type of atmosphere. We generally know that we need an environment where people feel willing to come forward and talk with us, where we need to have sense making occurring so that people can make good decisions, right? All of these things are things that we know. So I'm sure that as I was going through this presentation, a lot of this was resonating with you. It's just a matter of collating all of these topics under one overarching concept, which is resilience engineering. So I wouldn't say that I've seen many organizations that are actively aware of the steps that they're taking towards resiliency because it's a newer concept. So it's just now that we're introducing the concept in a more meaningful way, we can talk about safety in a different way. I almost don't even like using the word safety, right? I almost just want to shift our industry from relying on that word safety only because it is tied so intimately with that traditional view, and it does have a specific connotation with it. When you shift the language away from safety and towards resiliency, not only are we transcending safety management systems, but we're also creating a level of curiosity within our organizations, right? What is resiliency? What does that mean? How can we improve on that? So resiliency engineering in and of itself isn't a particular practice. It's a collation of things that are ongoing in your organization, and it will never end. So similar to how, or different to how we view safety management systems, whereas once we have the people and the processes and the technology in place, we're good to go. Resilience engineering never stops, and safety management doesn't either, but it's just a general perception or something that I've seen happen over time, right? Safety management systems tend to fall by the wayside. Resilience engineering is more about the ongoing practices of our organization that are continually fostering an environment where our organization can adapt, can monitor, can learn, can respond in a meaningful way with little to no outcomes.
Thank you so much, Madeline, and thank you so much for breaking this down in such a clear way and your eloquence about it. I think it is a very creative, exciting, and definitely a framework shifter for the world of safety to really think about how can we be resilient in our organization. So with that, I want to say thank you to everyone who has been here today and for the great questions. I did post the link for part 2, which is the practical application of this in your organizations. So I hope that we see you all back here on November 18th. And Madeline, I don't know if you have a slide with contact information after your resources. She's like, yes, I do.
I thought I did, but it's not in here. But
There it is.
it's just,
Polaris Aero. I know I can probably put the link up there. You can Google them, and I will put this right here on the polarisaero.com. And you all will see that now and have that information. So perfect. Madeline, thank you again so much. It's always enlightening. And as I mentioned, I thank you all for being here today at the IBAC SafetyNet webinar series. I can't wait to hear and see what you have to say in a month, Madeline. So thank you. You all have a happy Halloween, or wherever you are in the world, however you celebrate, and we'll see you all next time.